I took this server with 4 Raspberry Pis inside
and brought it 100 miles away to my cousin's farm. This is a Turing Pi 2 cluster, and it's hosting my website live on the internet completely off grid. And it's freezing cold out here. Why are we doing this outside? It's a bad idea. But it just shows that I'm still connected to the internet. So I'm harnessing the power of the sun and using a 4G LTE modem to connect this Pi cluster to the internet. I can literally pick up this battery and server and go anywhere without being bound by the shackles of the grid. But I had to solve a lot of problems to get here. How do I keep it powered on? How do I connect it to the internet? And how can I get my website to run on it? Buckle up, because we're going to solve all those problems. But first, the most important problem, how do I pay for all this?
Well, check out this video's sponsor, EcoFlow. EcoFlow builds some of the best battery power stations on the market, from the Delta Pro that could run your whole house to the River Mini, great for portable power wherever you go. Their power stations have some of the fastest charging times on the market. They're lightweight and rugged, and they also sell a variety of solar panels to solve all your energy needs, whether you're off-grid or you need backup power for your home. You can find out more about EcoFlow in the link in this video's description.
So the biggest problem for my off-grid cluster is power. Most servers you'd use in data centers eat up hundreds of watts all day long. But even this server, a tiny little cluster of 4 Raspberry Pis, uses about 20 watts when it's running. That might not seem like much. Heck, there are even small solar panels that can put out 50 or 100 watts. But if you want this thing to stay up 24/7, you're going to need a battery. And that's why I called up EcoFlow. This battery might look like overkill, but if I'm going to host my website off-grid, I need it to stay up, even if there's a big storm or a few overcast days that block out all the sun. And speaking of overkill, EcoFlow also sent 2 of these. They're massive 400-watt portable solar panels. Together, they absorb 800 watts on a sunny day and charge up the battery in a little over 2 hours. They're not really overkill though, because solar power is always a little funky. The angle of the sun could be off, and even a slight haze will affect how much power they put out. Plus, well, there's nighttime and there's no sunlight at all. And right now, during winter, there are only a few hours when I can get full power. So I've been testing this setup, and I can pull in enough power to run the cluster and charge the battery, even on an overcast day. And the battery has enough capacity to run the cluster for at least 2 days, even if the sun is completely blocked by storm clouds or hazy weather. So I can run the cluster indefinitely, at least for a few years until the battery on this thing wears out. Power was a surprisingly easy problem to solve, but the next one turned out a little harder. And that problem is internet access. If you want to go truly portable, you don't have a lot of options. Out here on this farm, I asked my cousin Annie what kind of speeds she gets with her DSL, and well,
with DSL, we are crawling at 3.72 megabits per second download speeds and a whopping 0.36 megabits per second upload speeds. So not ideal for work.
Getting a new fiber or cable line laid out here would cost a ton of money, and there are a lot of places on the planet where wired options just aren't possible. Like, what if you're on the road and you want to run the website from your car? So wireless it is. I could try to get satellite, but there are a couple problems. Satellite receivers aren't usually portable, plus the best option for upload speeds and latency, Starlink, isn't available here. So I chose to go with 4G LTE. In most parts of the world, you can get 4G or 5G wireless data, even if you're miles away from civilization. It's not the perfect solution for everyone, but it's good enough. And performance isn't too bad. Heck, in more densely populated areas, you might be able to get better upload speeds through cell towers than you can with wired options. I tested a 4G modem at my house and could get 10 to 20 megabits up and down without a problem. I also tested out here on the farm and got 10 megabits, so while it's not going to win records for speed, it should have enough to host my website, which uses 2 to 3 megabits per second on a normal day. But getting 4G working on the Pi cluster wasn't easy.
For 4G on the Turing Pi, I installed this Quectel 4G modem. And that should be the end of the story, but no, it wouldn't even show up. So I told the Turing Pi engineers about the problem, and they said they'd get back to me. But I couldn't just wait and hope they found a fix. I needed a backup in case I couldn't get it working in time. So I asked my dad, and he handed me this, a $500 Cradle Point. It's basically the same thing as a MiFi wireless hotspot, but way more rugged. I turned it on and it worked, but then I found out I had 2 more problems to deal with. First, I couldn't get a static IP address meaning people couldn't access my cluster over the internet. And that's because of this thing called CG-NAT. Think of it like calling someone on a phone. With a normal phone number, I can call you from my phone and you can call me back. That's like a public IP address. But with something like CG-NAT, my phone number is actually a private number that my phone company gives me, but it's only internal in their buildings. I can call out to any public phone number because the phone company will route my call, but nobody can call me directly because my phone number isn't actually a public phone number. That's probably the biggest problem with off-grid web hosting, but I'll get to that a bit later. Another problem is how I networked the 4 Raspberry Pis together. Kubernetes, which I'll talk about in a bit, doesn't like IP addresses or these phone numbers for these things changing all the time, so I had to program my own little network to make sure Kubernetes didn't get confused. And while I was going through all that testing with the Cradlepoint, Turing Pi actually got back to me and said they had a fix for the onboard modem. All you have to do, they said, is remove this little resistor. Except little doesn't even begin to describe the tiny size of the resistor. Look at it, it's like the size of a grain of sand. But I got to work using my tiny tweezers and a soldering iron, and luckily it wasn't too bad. I booted the Turing Pi back up with my 4G modem installed, and it worked, so I unplugged the Cradlepoint and switched to the modem on the Turing Pi board. But now I had a third problem. With the Cradlepoint, it's an independent router. It works with whatever computers you plug into it. But using a modem on the Turing Pi board, that modem is connected directly to the first Raspberry Pi here, and it doesn't share that connection to the other Pis. So I had to spend a few days figuring out a solution. I set up the first Pi as a router so it could share its internet connection with the other Pis. I could have installed something like OpenWRT on this Pi, but then I couldn't join it to the Kubernetes cluster since OpenWRT can't run Kubernetes. So instead I just set up some custom routing rules on the normal Pi OS install and took care of that problem. Before I go any further though, I have to give a big warning. Running a Pi connected to 4G 24/7 could eat up a lot of data, and most 4G plans aren't unlimited, and they have huge overage charges. So make sure if you do something crazy like this, you know how much data you're using and choose an appropriate data plan. I calculated that with my current traffic, my website would cost $5,000 a month to run on 4G, so yeah, another problem to solve. Networking is a bit crazy, but you know what else is crazy? Relying on a Raspberry Pi to run a production website that gets a lot of traffic. Or is it? A lot of people say Pis are flaky and can be unreliable. But here's a wise sysadmin secret. You should treat every single computer like it's flaky and unreliable, whether it's a $10,000 Dell PowerEdge server or a $30 Raspberry Pi. But how do you deal with this problem? Well, don't rely on one single computer. That's why I installed Kubernetes, or more specifically K3s on this cluster. Kubernetes is a system that pools together multiple computers, or nodes, and runs applications on them. And the Turing Pi has 4 Raspberry Pis, or 4 nodes, that can all be pooled together to run my website. To make sure things run well, even when one of the Pis breaks, I tell Kubernetes how to split up my web server software so the website will self-heal if any of the Pis go offline. Now, I know what you're thinking. What about that first Raspberry Pi? Isn't it doing all the internet routing with the 4G modem? Well, yeah, with my setup, if the first Pi goes down, I'm toast. So it's not perfect. There's this single point of failure. But even there, I can work around temporary internet outages, and I'll talk about how I'm doing that later. But applications themselves are the things that usually break, like Drupal or MariaDB. When they blow up, it's chaos, so Kubernetes takes care of that. And you might think I'm crazy running a website and database on microSD cards, but don't worry, I'm not doing that. I set up these 2 SSDs and a ZFS mirrored volume, so either drive could break and all my data would still be there. Then I set up Kubernetes to store the database and all my website data on the SSDs using persistent volumes and NFS. You might be asking at this point, how did you do all that? Well, I can't get too deep in this video, but I did post a ton of guides going through everything from how I set up 4G to how I set up ZFS on the Pis. I even have an entire free Kubernetes 101 series on YouTube. Check that out by clicking the card up there. But we're still not done here. Kubernetes keeps my software running, but what about the hardware? How do I protect the Turing Pi board from the elements? And how do I take it on the road without it getting banged up? Well, I got this ITX rack mount case from My Electronics in the Netherlands, and I did a whole video on racking up the Turing Pi inside it. But then to protect that, I bought this soft 2U road case that's built for carrying around sound equipment. And knowing how roadies treat their gear, this bag can take a beating. It's not waterproof, but it fits the Turing Pi 2 cluster perfectly, and as long as I leave the front and back unzipped, there's plenty of ventilation to keep it cool. So now I can transport the cluster safely, and I use Kubernetes to keep things running even if one of the Pis goes offline. But how do I make sure that when you go and visit jeffgeerling.com, that request makes it to this cluster? I said earlier I had to deal with CG-NAT. There's no easy way to access my cluster from the public internet, so what's the fix? There are a few options. I could use a VPN or a hosted service like Tailscale or Cloudflare tunnels, but I don't want to rely on someone else's service. I already host my website on a VPS from DigitalOcean. It's just a boring old Ubuntu server, but it does have a static IP address like that public phone number I mentioned earlier. That means I can point the jeffgeerling.com domain name at it and people can reach my website. But to make it so the website is actually served from my Pi cluster, I have to set up the server as what's called a reverse proxy. A reverse proxy accepts requests from the public internet. Then it distributes those requests to private servers running behind it. And since I'm using Nginx on my server, I can also set it up to be a caching proxy. That means I can save a ton of data usage by having the VPS handle all the traffic for things like images and static web pages. If I serve all the traffic over the 4G wireless connection, like all my site's pictures, CSS, and JavaScript, then I could serve about 1 or 2 pages per second, and the time per page load is sometimes up in the 5 to 10 second range. But if I configure Nginx to cache all the static content on the faster VPS, I can serve over 100 pages per second. That means even if my website gets hit by a lot of traffic from Reddit or Hacker News, it should stay up and running. The only major risk is if a lot of people post comments at the same time because all that traffic has to go through to the cluster, so the comments get saved in the site's database. So caching is important. Besides saving me thousands of dollars per month in data charges, this has a side benefit that if the 4G connection goes down temporarily, the reverse proxy can keep serving my website from its cache, at least for a while. But how does my VPS know how to connect to the Pi cluster? For that, I decided to set up a reverse tunnel using SSH. Basically, I have the main node with the 4G internet connection set up to stay connected to the VPS all day using a feature called TCP forwarding. Using a little service I set up on the cluster, it sets up a persistent tunnel through to the VPS, and if the connection ever stops working, it'll reconnect automatically. Using this, I can set up Nginx to proxy web requests to the Pi cluster like it was running on the same server, just on a different port. If all this sounds a little complicated, it is. That's why this video is taken about 2 months to make. Check out my blog posts if you want all the details.
So now I have my main VPS set up to accept requests for jeffgeerling.com. When you click on one of the blog links down in the description, the VPS routes that request through Nginx and the reverse SSH tunnel, then the request hits Kubernetes. Kubernetes routes the request to an instance of Drupal running on the Pi cluster, then Drupal sends back a web page, the VPS passes that back to you, and bingo, you get to see my website served up from anywhere in the world. Of course, if someone else clicked the link in the last few minutes, it'll probably be cached, in which case my VPS will skip sending the request all the way through to the Pi cluster, and I'll be able to afford my mortgage this month. I'm not going to lie and say this is a better setup than hosting my website on my VPS. It's slower, more prone to dropouts, and the whole setup is a lot more complicated, meaning failures can be harder to troubleshoot. But it is a fun learning experience, and there are plenty of use cases for a resilient, off-grid, low-power cluster of computers that make a lot more sense than web hosting.
Back in 2014, after reflecting on major disasters like Hurricane Katrina and the 2011 tsunami in Japan, there was a paper written on wireless networks for disaster relief. It mentions the importance of having wireless communication systems in place after disaster strikes, because emergency personnel can't rely on the existing infrastructure, which might have been completely destroyed. Especially today, with all our communications platforms tied to the internet, having the ability to run a local cluster of low-power servers managing applications like databases and check-in systems can help first responders in a bind. And many existing solutions cost thousands of dollars. If you could build a resilient edge cluster like this one for a few $100 and even have a spare, well, that makes a lot of sense to me. Or what about events like music festivals? They're often far from power and internet connections, so having a mobile Kubernetes cluster that can run ticketing and on-site organization software is critical, and helps a lot if you only have sporadic internet access. And finally, it's nice to have options, especially as new, faster wireless communications become mainstream. And maybe if you have unlimited data, you could conceivably do things like host a website or a game server off-grid and live your best van life. And before you go in the comments and ask why a cluster of Raspberry Pis, I'll answer that too. Sure, you could just run all this on a single NUC or an old laptop, but then we're back to the sysadmin's dilemma. How can you rely on just one physical server? The answer is you don't. But it's true that Raspberry Pis aren't the best performing option, but they're relatively cheap when you can find them, and they're great for learning.
I learned a heck of a lot on this journey. I learned how to power a remote Kubernetes cluster indefinitely using solar power and a battery. I learned how to integrate 4G wireless internet into a cluster of computers. I learned how to proxy web traffic through a self-healing reverse SSH tunnel to get past CG-NAT. I also learned it's probably not a great idea to run my website like this, even if it does work. And like everything else I do, all the code I used, all the automation, all the instructions, it's all open source on GitHub. Go check out the link in the description. See how professional we are?
That didn't go how I planned.
Talking is getting very hard.
You're spilling food on the floor. You'd never make it as a farmer.
That's okay, I didn't choose this life.
It chose you. There you go.
Making this video was a lot of fun, and a lot of work. I wanted to thank EcoFlow one last time for sponsoring this video, and Harmon Farms for having me out to their place. And for the cows for cooperating even though it was about -10°C with 20-mile-per-hour wind gusts. Check out all the links below, and yeah, until next time, I'm Jeff Geerling.